All I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by. In essence, that's the incredible premise at the heart of Star Trek, which has kept us watching week after week for over 50 years. Star Trek is a great idea. The rest is making the most of it. Such is the nature of the creative process and of television that even some of Star Trek's now most celebrated episodes didn't go from concept to screen unchanged. For what is the best of both worlds? Writer Michael Piller admitted in Captain's Logs, the unauthorized complete Trek Voyages, that we had no idea it was really a Riker story when we started out, and that it took a while to think up Locutus. The reverse then is also true. Sometimes the most extraordinary premises fail to come to fruition in the episodes they've been given. Worse, there are those ideas that should have shaken the galaxy and the franchise to its core, but were never spoken of again. The mystery of the preservers was wasted on whatever the Paradise Syndrome turned out to be, and the mind-blowing revelation from perhaps the same species in The Chase were relegated to archaeological curiosity. None of the above makes for a bad episode either, just a lost opportunity. We should all just be glad that A Briefing with Neelix or Good Morning Voyager was apparently axed. With all that out of the way, I'm Bree from TrekCulture, and here are 10 episodes that wasted an incredible premise. Number 10, That Hope Is You, Part 1 and 2. From what had been a pretty awesome second season, Star Trek Discovery took a jump to the 32nd century. It was a bold idea, ripe for storytelling. The 32nd century was previously an unexplored century, and there were hundreds of years of largely unknown history to fill in before it. In the first act of the first episode of the third season in this new century, we learned of an event called the Burn. Basically, when all dilithium suddenly went inert around 3069, every active warp core exploded, causing death and destruction on a massive scale, radically altering the political and technological landscape of the spacefaring galaxy. In hindsight, however, That Hope Is You Part 1 got our hopes up. The premise of the Burn was incredible. Its explanation stretched belief, however. One of the main problems was the why of the Burn was left to a protracted investigation throughout Discovery's third season. During the wait for an answer, theories abounded from those genuinely excited by figuring it all out in advance. To say that the solution, given in That Hope Is You Part 2, was disappointing would be putting it mildly. With so many opportunities to link the Burn to other parts of canon, or to innovate with something new to match the stakes, the lone Kelpian option was truly a waste of a great premise. Number 9, Conspiracy. We've said it before and we'll say it again until we're blue in the face. Bring back the butt bugs. You'd think the invasion of Starfleet into its upper echelons by a very non-humanoid species was too good of an idea to leave on a one and done. However, while events to come had been somewhat telegraphed in Coming of Age, the epic bluegill premise was pretty much confined to Conspiracy. In Drumhead, we did find out that Admiral Nora Sati had played a crucial role in exposing the butt bug plot. After that, the little parasites had no further impact on canon than a slight uptick on subreddits on Talgana 4. That doesn't mean Conspiracy was a waste of an episode by any means. In fact, it was one of the best of a rough season, and it certainly swung for the fences when it came to gruesome special effects. It all comes down to budget and the episodic nature of Star Trek at the time, but there could easily have been a whole miniseries about the Bluegills depicting their discovery and schemes for galactic domination before the Enterprise D even entered the frame. In fact, according to the Star Trek Next Generation companion, the original idea for Conspiracy didn't have any bluegills at all. Instead, it was regular members of Starfleet who were plotting against the Prime Directive and Federation-wide complacency following the Klingon detente. That plot became central to Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, and in a more roundabout way, to the next entry on this list. Number 8, Star Trek Insurrection. At first, you might be wondering what a movie is doing on this list about Star Trek episodes. Well, we do like to keep you at red alert, but more to the point, as we've previously discussed on this channel, Star Trek Insurrection has always seemed more like an extended two-parter than a feature length. For theaters, it just didn't quite work, but it probably would have made a strong enough outing on television. At the movies, however, Insurrection was a bit bland. Whatever the morale, telling it through the prism of an interstellar band of privileged wannabe neo-Luddites made the whole thing a little difficult to care about. Insurrection was also not without similarities to an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, Homeward. At its core, however, the film did have quite the premise: the rebellion against Starfleet and the Federation by one Captain Picard and crew. The idea of the usually by-the-books captain forced to turn against Starfleet and the Federation has already played out in the now Admiral's eponymous TV show. To a lesser extent, we've also seen Jean-Luc Picard defying Starfleet orders at the start of Star Trek First Contact, so a full-on rebellion in the next film made a degree of sense. Insurrection could have been the Next Generation's search for Spock, but instead of Starfleet just being in the way, they would have been thoroughly up to no good. Who knows, maybe we'll see this movie on a dumbest things list in the future. But until then, saddle up, lock and load. Number 7. Learning Curve. Once more, this is not a bad episode of Star Trek. It is, however, emblematic of a larger issue Star Trek Voyager faced. In its focus on a group of errant Maquis crew members, and on a problem with the bioneural gel packs, Learning Curve, the last episode of Voyager's first season, is perhaps the ultimate example of the waste of not one, but two premises that were, in theory, supposed to be central to the series itself. Learning Curve does its best to broach the subject of Maquis-Starfleet relations, but by that time, only 4 of the former Maquis that we knew of were apparently having difficulties with their new working arrangements. The two crews had begun as enemies, or at least as opponents in a conflict, but in the Delta Quadrant, they rapidly became friends and colleagues. It wouldn't be entirely smooth sailing after, but Learning Curve does feel like one last bump in the road for a topic that could have been explored in far greater depth. And then there was the cheese. It was with a sense of urgency that Captain Janeway described the risk of running out of bioneural gel packs when one was found in need of replacement. They had 47 left in reserve, and that was it. After that, it would be bye-bye most of Voyager's critical systems, even with some isolinear switchovers. However, like for photon torpedoes and shuttles, lack was never really an issue ever again. Number 6. Fury. In Cinefantastic, Volume 33, Number 5, Brian Fuller, who co-wrote the teleplay for Fury, explained how he started on Star Trek Voyager. Actually, the reason I got brought into Voyager in the first place was to come up with a way to kill Kes off. I came up with the story for the Gift. Her whole evolution into a different phase of Ocampan life was my idea. Nonetheless, Fuller was equally happy with the twist that he helped devise for Kes's return. In the Cinefantastic piece, he also pointed out most fans had been looking forward to a comeback for Kes, but the way in which it was done was surprising to say the least. Kes's angry, vengeful persona always struck a little odd. It jarred with her still entirely affable self of the Gift. Of course, people do change. That might be especially true for the Ocampa, a species whose average lifespan was only about 8 to 9 years. In Fury, Kes was barely recognizable, however, seeming like an almost entirely different character even by the episode's end. Fury also stumbled somewhat over an explanation for such a dramatic shift in personality, merely stating that Kes wasn't ready for her transformation and got lost along the way. Ultimately, for a character we'd known for 3 seasons, her final appearance could have been better spent than in trying to deliver Voyager to the nearest organ harvest. Number 5. Assignment Earth. The original premise for Assignment Earth is more unique than most on this list. The episode was meant to produce a spin-off series starring Robert Lansing as Gary 7. We'll never know what the quality of the show would have been, but the fact that it was never made leaves us with an episode of Star Trek the original series that can only ever feel like the beginning of something better. The Supervisor-Watcher storyline did get an addendum in the 2nd season of Star Trek Picard. In that, Orla Brady's T'Lyn had been chosen for service as a supervisor, and Picard made a comparison between her and Gary 7, who was recruited by superior beings to protect the tapestry of history. At the end of the season, it was revealed that Wesley Crusher and his colleagues, aka the Travelers, were the ones who sent out the supervisors. We know so very little about the Travelers that their reveal as the heretofore mysterious alien abductors of Gary 7's ancestors from Assignment Earth seemed almost anecdotal. The brief Traveler recruitment pitch scene in Farewell was also the last we saw of Wesley, chronologically speaking, or as close to that as he can be, making it a waste of 2 premises. There's still hope, however. We're not going to be getting a Gary and Wesley traveling detective agency, the Assignment Earth spinoff, anytime soon, but both characters could show up anywhere, anytime, and especially in Star Trek Discovery. Number 4. Threshold. In the 24th century edition of the Dictionary of Federation Standard, under the entry for incredible, meaning too extraordinary to be believed, Tom Paris's Warp 10 record and the silliness that followed will be cited as an example. Nonetheless, deep down in the weirdness of Threshold, there is, somewhere, a fantastic premise. Go fast. It made perfect sense that the crew of Voyager would begin experimenting with even the craziest ideas in their effort to get back home, just so long as it was all in line with the Starfleet and Federation principles-ish. At some point, they were bound to try and beef up their maximum warp speed. The problem with Threshold is that they went straight to Warp 10, which, as the episode itself states, is a theoretical impossibility. Between Star Trek the original series and Star Trek the Next Generation, changes were made to the warp scale to put in place an upper speed limit. As the Star Trek Next Generation technical manual states, our solution was to redraw the warp curve so the exponent of the warp factor increases gradually, then sharply after Warp 9 as you approach Warp 10. At Warp 10, the exponent and the speed would be infinite, so you could never reach this value. However, if we do assume Warp 10 is achievable but has side effects, why didn't Voyager just use the new form of dilithium they found to supercharge the warp engines? You don't need Warp 10 if you're actually capable of it. Every decimal point you can add past Warp 9 already represents a vast increase in speed and warp. That being said, Warp 9.999999999 reoccurring would have had them back to Earth in a jiffy. Of course, the power requirements would have been enormous, and they'd probably just have run out of the new dilithium. Back to the salamander babies after all. Number 3. These are the Voyages. We've previously called These Are the Voyages weird, and now we're going with wasted. It's really not looking great for the series finale of Enterprise. To agree with Brandon Braga when he said that it was a cool concept, but it was languid, the core premise of the episode was actually quite a good one. It was only the application and execution that let it down. We all love a crossover, and that was the basic idea. A future Starfleet gazing upon its past self, or vice versa, was not a new concept, nor one that had gone out of fashion. It was done most recently with panache and just a bit of time travel in Those Old Scientists, and previously with the transporter in Relics, and mind meld in Flashback. Through the temporal Cold War, a good deal of Enterprise was explicitly linked to the future from day one. The show within a show on the holodeck could have worked, just not as the end to the series. It did provide for a different perspective on the characters from both eras, reminding us that the events of Enterprise we were watching were also a piece of history. Writer Aaron Waltke took the idea and ran with it to create the brilliantly clever short trek Holograms All the Way Down. Speaking of the very short treks, number 2, all the very short treks, bar 1. The premise? A celebration of animation and Star Trek for the 50th anniversary of Star Trek the Animated Series. The result? 5, to quote the teaser trailer, anything but canon, exceedingly short non-episodes that seriously missed the point. In amongst them, only one, perhaps two, was doing any celebrating, and that's Holograms All the Way Down. It appears that there were tonal problems from the start. Casper Kelly, the series showrunner and creative consultant brought on by Alex Kurtzman, has described the very short treks as both a sort of experimental low-pressure bet and even a little more fucked up than Lower Decks. Kelly is clearly a fan of the animated series, but by his own admission in The Making of Star Trek Very Short Treks with Casper Kelly, wasn't that conscious about sort of celebrating it and just focused on what was funny. Sadly, most of us weren't laughing along. Instead of a proper homage to the 1970s series and the more recent animated outings, the mini-minisodes were mostly an unfunny hodgepodge of fart jokes, snot, and a pun too far. Moreover, if you add the very short treks up, they equal, or thereabouts, the length of an episode of the animated series. It might have been a better idea to just do that. Apparently, a further 5 scripts were written and never made it to air. Maybe next year, Kelly mused in the making of. If it's more of the same, I think we'll pass. Number 1. The Stargazer and Farewell. Some of us are, understandably, a bit borged out by now. Seasons 1 to 3 of Star Trek Picard all had the cybernetically enhanced assimilators as a focus, often the primary. Collective fatigue or no, there is still one Borg, or Borg-adjacent story from Picard that has been left dangling. It's often difficult to choose just one episode with serialized television, so we've picked 2, which encapsulate the matter at hand and the season. The premise that began Picard's season outing in The Stargazer was, to summarize heavily, galaxy-threatening anomaly. Borg and Queen appear, then there are explosions, and Q. By the second season, Farewell, Q had died. For a bit, the Borg Queen had been revealed to be a benevolent Jurati spinoff, and the anomaly had become a humongous transwarp conduit. Aside from the odd oblique reference such as Captain Shaw's "forget about the weird shit on the Stargazer," these events have never been mentioned again. Of course, this could all be deliberate, there's still more Star Trek to come after all, but for now, it feels more like a waste of a great premise. As far as we know, Jurati and her collective are still waiting at the gates for whoever or whatever superpower might come through. And those were 10 Star Trek episodes that wasted an incredible premise. If you liked the video, then make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you aren't already. Can you think of any episodes that we missed? If so, then leave them in the comments section below. If you want to keep up with us on social media, we're on Twitter and Blue Sky at TrekCulture and on Instagram at TrekCultureYT. If you want to find me across various social medias, simply search Trekkie Bree. With all that being said, I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and don't forget to live long and prosper.